In the twilight of a dying age, when marble columns still gleamed white against the Aegean sky but the hearts of men had grown dim with war and plague, a young aristocrat named Aristocles walked through the dusty streets of Athens. The year was somewhere between 428 and 423 before the Common Era, and the city that would become the birthplace of Western philosophy was caught between the fading glory of its golden age and the approaching shadow of its darkest hour. The boy who would come to be known as Plato, a nickname that may have referred to his broad shoulders, his broad forehead, or perhaps the breadth of his intellect, though modern scholars largely dismiss this ancient gossip as unreliable folklore, was born into a world that seemed to hold infinite promise even as it teetered on the edge of collapse. But before we journey too far into the mists of antiquity, before we walk with this young man through the agora where Socrates would teach and die, before we ascend with him to contemplate the eternal forms that exist beyond the flickering shadows of our material world, I want to ask something of you, dear listener. If you're finding yourself drifting into that delicious space between waking and sleeping, if the story of this ancient philosopher is beginning to weave itself into the fabric of your dreams, take just a moment now to subscribe to this channel and leave a like on this video. You see, you'll likely be fast asleep before this tale reaches its conclusion, lost in visions of torchlit caves and sunlit groves where wisdom flows like honey. So do it now, while consciousness still has its gentle hold on you, and then settle back into your pillows, let your breathing slow, and allow me to guide you through the extraordinary life of a man who dared to imagine a world ruled not by force or wealth, but by wisdom itself. Now let us begin. The Athens into which Plato was born was a city of contradictions, a democracy that enslaved tens of thousands, a beacon of enlightenment that would execute its wisest citizen, a maritime empire that would soon lie broken beneath the heel of Sparta. The sounds of the city would have filled young Plato's ears from his earliest days, the rhythmic clang of bronze smiths hammering in their workshops, their tools ringing against shields and helmets, and the countless implements of war that Athens's maritime empire demanded in endless quantities. The bleating of sheep and goats being driven to market through narrow streets barely wide enough for two carts to pass, their hooves clicking on worn stones that had felt the tread of thousands of sandaled feet, the calls of merchants hawking their wares of oil and wine and cloth, each vendor crying out in competition with his neighbors, creating a symphony of commercial chaos that rose and fell like waves upon the shore. The susurrus of 1,000 conversations in the agora, that great open marketplace that served as the beating heart of Athenian public life, where political factions schemed, where philosophers debated, where the very fabric of democracy was woven each day in countless small transactions of power and persuasion. The smells, too, would have been distinctive and overwhelming to modern senses. The sharp, clean tang of the sea carried on the wind from Piraeus, the port city connected to Athens by the famous long walls that would later prove both Athens' salvation and its prison during the dark years of the plague. The acrid smoke from countless cooking fires, rising from 1,000 hearths to create a perpetual haze that hung over the city like a shroud. The sweet, heavy scent of incense burning at the many shrines scattered throughout the city, dedicated to Zeus and Athena, to Poseidon and Apollo, to the countless lesser deities and heroes who populated the Greek religious landscape. The less pleasant but omnipresent odors of human and animal waste in streets that, for all Athens' cultural achievements, were not so different from any other ancient cities, where sanitation was a matter of tossing refuse out windows and hoping the next rain would wash it away. The Athens of Plato's childhood was still basking in the afterglow of its golden age. Less than 50 years before his birth, the city had played a crucial role in defeating the mighty Persian Empire when Xerxes attempted his massive invasion. The naval victory at Salamis in 480, achieved largely through Athenian ships and Athenian courage, had established Athens as the premier naval power in the Greek world. In the decades that followed, Athens had transformed this military success into political dominance, creating the Delian League, ostensibly a defensive alliance against future Persian aggression, but in reality an Athenian empire that controlled hundreds of city-states throughout the Aegean. The wealth that flowed into Athens from this empire was staggering. Tribute poured in from subject cities, enriching not just the state coffers but creating a prosperous merchant class and funding the great building projects that would make Athens the wonder of the ancient world. Under the leadership of Pericles, who dominated Athenian politics for 3 decades, the city embarked on an unprecedented program of construction. The Parthenon, that magnificent temple to Athena that still crowns the Acropolis today, was completed when Plato was perhaps 15 or 16 years old. Its gleaming marble, its perfect proportions, its elaborate friezes depicting the great mythological and historical moments of Athenian glory, all of this was new, fresh, stunning to behold when young Plato would have first climbed the sacred hill to participate in the great religious festivals that punctuated the Athenian year. But this golden age rested on foundations that were already crumbling even as Plato drew his first breath. The very success of Athens had bred resentment and fear among the other Greek city-states, particularly Sparta, that austere military society in the Peloponnesus that represented everything Athens was not. Where Athens was democratic, Sparta was oligarchic. Where Athens celebrated the arts and philosophy, Sparta valued only military prowess. Where Athenians were merchants and sailors, Spartans were soldiers and landowners. The two cities were natural rivals, and the growing power of Athens made conflict increasingly inevitable. Plato's family was not merely wealthy, they were among the Athenian elite, their bloodlines traced back to the very foundations of the city. Through his mother, Pryxian, he was descended from Solon himself, that legendary lawgiver who had laid the groundwork for Athenian democracy more than a century and a half before Plato's birth. Solon, who had reformed the harsh laws of Draco, who had abolished debt slavery, who had established the foundations of citizenship and democratic participation that would make Athens unique in the ancient world. This was Plato's ancestor. Whether one believed such genealogical claims or not, and in ancient Athens as in all times, the distant past could be conveniently reshaped to serve present purposes. There was no denying that Plato's family moved in the highest circles of Athenian society. Through his father Ariston, the family claimed descent from Codrus, the last king of Athens, and through him back to the god Poseidon himself. This claim to divine ancestry was not unusual among Greek aristocrats. Nearly every noble family could trace their lineage back to some god or hero, but it nonetheless gave Plato's family a certain prestige, a connection to Athens's mythological past that was valued in a society that saw no clear boundary between history and legend. Plato's father Ariston died when Plato was still quite young, perhaps when he was no more than 4 or 5 years old. The loss of a father at such a tender age must have left its mark, though we can only speculate about its psychological impact. What we know is that Pryxian soon remarried, to her uncle Pyrilampus, a prominent politician who had been close to Pericles himself. This connection to Pericles, the great statesman who had guided Athens through its golden age, meant that young Plato grew up in a household intimately connected to the centers of power in Athens. He had 2 full brothers, Adimantus and Glaucon, who would later appear as interlocutors in his masterwork, The Republic. There was also a sister, Petone, and a half-brother named Antiphon, born to his mother after his father's death when she remarried Pyrilampus. Growing up in such a household meant that young Plato would have been exposed from his earliest years to the cut and thrust of political debate, the subtle maneuverings of power, the way that men used words as weapons in the assembly and the law courts. The dinner table conversation in Plato's home would have revolved around the great questions of the day. Should Athens expand its empire further? How should it deal with rebellious subject cities? What was the best strategy for confronting Sparta's growing hostility? According to the biographer Diogenes Laertius, whose accounts are often unreliable but sometimes our only source for certain details of ancient lives, Plato's brothers Glaucon and Adimantus distinguished themselves at the Battle of Megara in 409, when Plato would have been around 18 or 19 years old. This military service was expected of all Athenian male citizens, and it provided young aristocrats with their first taste of the realities of war and violence that would shape their world. Like all sons of wealthy Athenian families, Plato would have received the education befitting a young aristocrat. This education was comprehensive and designed to produce not scholars but well-rounded citizens capable of participating fully in the democratic life of the polis. The curriculum would have featured gymnastics, not just athletic training for its own sake, but a deliberate cultivation of the body that was seen as essential to developing a complete human being. Young Plato would have spent hours in the gymnasium, wrestling and running, throwing the discus and javelin, developing the physical strength and grace that were considered marks of nobility. Ancient sources tell us that Plato was an accomplished wrestler in his youth, even competing in athletic contests. His nickname, Platon, may have come from this period of his life, referring to his broad, athletic physique, though as mentioned, modern scholars treat this etymology with skepticism. Whether the nickname came from wrestling prowess or some other source, it replaced his birth name of Aristocles so completely that we know him only by this appellation. But physical education was only one component of an aristocratic Athenian boy's training. He would also have been instructed in music, not just the playing of the lyre, but the understanding of rhythm, harmony, and melody that the Greeks considered essential to cultivating the soul. Music and poetry were intimately connected in Greek culture, and young Plato would have memorized vast quantities of Homer and Hesiod, the epic poets whose works formed the foundation of Greek education and culture. He would have learned the tragedies of Aeschylus and Sophocles, perhaps even seeing them performed at the great dramatic festivals that were among Athens's most important cultural events. He would have studied mathematics, arithmetic and geometry, not as abstract exercises but as practical skills needed for commerce, architecture and military engineering. He would have learned rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking that was absolutely essential for any Athenian who hoped to make his mark in public life. In the democracy of Athens, where policy was decided by mass votes and the assembly and courts had juries of hundreds of citizens, the ability to speak persuasively could mean the difference between political success and failure, between winning and losing a lawsuit, sometimes even between life and death. But the idyllic childhood of an Athenian aristocrat was not to be Plato's fate. For as he grew from boy to youth, the very foundations of his world were being systematically destroyed by a war that would consume nearly 3 decades and leave the Greek world fundamentally transformed. The Peloponnesian War had begun in 431, when Plato was perhaps 4 or 5 years old enough to begin to understand that something terrible was happening, not yet old enough to fully comprehend the scale of the catastrophe that was unfolding. The origins of the war lay in the inevitable clash between Athens and Sparta, between democracy and oligarchy, between sea power and land power. The immediate cause was a dispute over Corcyra, a colony of Corinth, itself an ally of Sparta, that sought Athenian protection. When Athens allied with Corcyra and then took actions against another Corinthian colony, Potidaea, the fragile peace that had existed since the 30 Years' Treaty of 445 began to crumble. Sparta and its allies accused Athens of aggression and demanded that Athens dissolve its empire, allowing its subject cities to be autonomous. Athens, on the advice of Pericles, refused. In the spring of 431, Thebes, a Spartan ally, attacked Plataea, an Athenian ally, and the war began in earnest. At first, the war might have seemed distant to a child living within Athens's formidable walls. Plato would have heard the adults talking in worried tones, seen the increased military preparations, noticed the tension in the air as Athens prepared for what everyone knew would be a long and difficult conflict. The Spartan strategy, devised by their king Archidamus, was straightforward: invade Attica, the territory surrounding Athens, each year during the campaigning season, laying waste to the farms and olive groves, the vineyards and grain fields that had sustained the Athenian economy for generations. The Spartans knew they had the superior army. In a pitched battle on land, Spartan heavy infantry, the famous hoplites trained from childhood in the art of war, would inevitably defeat any force Athens could field. But Pericles, the towering figure who led Athens in these early years of the war, had developed a counter-strategy that was as brilliant as it was risky. The Athenians would not meet the Spartans in the open field where Sparta's heavy infantry would inevitably prevail. Instead, the entire population of the Attic countryside would retreat behind the long walls that connected Athens to its port at Piraeus, effectively turning the city into an island. Athens would rely on its superior navy to maintain supply lines by sea and to carry the war to Sparta's allies, raiding their coasts and disrupting their trade while the Spartans exhausted themselves marching back and forth across the devastated landscape of Attica. It was a strategy that might have worked. Indeed, it seemed to be working in those first months of the war. The Spartans invaded, burned farms, cut down olive trees that had taken decades to mature, destroyed crops in the fields. But they could not breach Athens's walls, and after a few weeks, they had to return home to tend to their own harvests and deal with the ever-present threat of a Helot revolt. The Athenian navy struck at Sparta's allies, demonstrating that Athens still controlled the seas and could project power throughout the Greek world. But Pericles and his strategists had failed to account for one factor that no amount of military genius could overcome. In the crowded, unsanitary conditions created by packing the entire rural population of Attica within the city walls, disease found the perfect breeding ground. The plague came to Athens in 430, in the second year of the war, arriving, according to the historian Thucydides who survived it himself, from Ethiopia by way of Egypt and Libya. It first appeared in Piraeus, the port city, leading many Athenians to suspect that the Spartans had somehow poisoned the water reservoirs, a theory Thucydides dismisses as groundless speculation born of desperate fear. From Piraeus, the disease spread rapidly into the overcrowded city of Athens proper, where the population had swelled to 3 or 4 times its normal size as refugees from the countryside crowded into every available space. Modern historians still debate the exact nature of the illness. Was it smallpox? Typhus? Some form of hemorrhagic fever now extinct? A combination of diseases that ravaged an immunologically naive population? Whatever its precise medical identity, its impact was devastating beyond measure. Thucydides, who caught the disease himself and survived, left us a description that still has the power to chill the blood across the gulf of 24 centuries. The illness began suddenly, he tells us, with violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes. The throat and tongue quickly became bloody, and the breath abnormal and malodorous. The sick could be identified at a distance by the foul smell emanating from their bodies. Sneezing and hoarseness followed, and soon the trouble descended into the chest, producing a violent cough that racked the body and left victims gasping for air. When the disease settled in the stomach, it brought on every kind of bilious distress, accompanied by great suffering. In most cases there followed ineffectual retching, producing violent spasms that in some cases ceased quickly but in others persisted long after there was anything left in the stomach to expel. The skin broke out in pustules and ulcers, the body burning with an internal heat so intense that patients could not bear even the lightest clothing and threw themselves into water cisterns seeking relief. Patients were tormented by an unquenchable thirst that drove them to drink enormous quantities of water, yet nothing could quench the fire that seemed to consume them from within. Those who survived the first week often lost fingers, toes, even hands and feet to gangrene. Some lost their eyesight. Many survivors suffered complete memory loss, unable to recognize friends or even remember their own names. Those who tended the sick caught the disease themselves and died in great numbers. Physicians who had the most contact with the ill died fastest of all, their knowledge of medicine proving utterly useless against this unprecedented scourge. The bodies of the dying were piled on top of one another in the temples where they had gone seeking refuge or divine intervention, their prayers unanswered, their offerings unavailing. Funeral pyres blazed day and night, the smoke of burning corpses darkening the sky, the smell of death pervading every corner of the city. The traditional rites of burial were abandoned as families simply lacked the strength or the will to properly honor their dead. Some threw the bodies of their loved ones onto pyres meant for strangers. Others, finding a funeral already in progress, would place their own dead upon the pyre and hastily depart before anyone could object. The disease killed, by some estimates, a quarter to a third of Athens's population, perhaps 75,000 to 100,000 souls perishing in those terrible years between 430 and 426. Among the dead were not just the poor and the weak, but Athens's most prominent citizens. The plague showed no respect for wealth or status, for piety or virtue. The good died alongside the wicked, the young alongside the old, the strong alongside the weak. Among those who succumbed was Pericles himself, the man who had guided Athens through its golden age and into this disastrous war, the man whose strategy of retreat behind the walls had inadvertently created the conditions for the plague's spread. Pericles died in 429, and his death left a vacuum in Athenian leadership that would never quite be filled. In his place rose lesser men, demagogues like Cleon, who lacked Pericles' vision and restraint but possessed a talent for swaying the masses in the assembly with inflammatory rhetoric. The democracy that Solon had founded and Pericles had perfected began to show its weaknesses, as the mob voted for policies based on passion rather than reason, for strategies that promised quick victory rather than long-term success. For young Plato, growing up amidst this catastrophe, the experience must have been profoundly formative. Imagine being 7, 8, 9 years old, watching your city descend into a kind of hell, seeing the smoke of funeral pyres darkening the sky from dawn to dusk, hearing the wails of the bereaved echoing through streets normally filled with the cheerful chaos of commerce and conversation, smelling death on every street corner. Imagine the fear that must have gripped children as they watched adults, those supposed paragons of strength and wisdom, reduced to helpless terror, unable to protect themselves or their families from an invisible enemy that struck without warning or mercy. Thucydides tells us that the plague brought with it a breakdown of all social and religious conventions that was in some ways as devastating as the physical disease itself. Men who had been wealthy and respected in the morning could be dead by evening, their property seized by others who knew they themselves might be dead within days. There was no point in planning for the future, no advantage in restraint or virtue when death could come for anyone at any moment. The uncertainty, the randomness of who would live and who would die, undermined every foundation of civilized life. Religious observance fell away. After all, those who were pious died just as readily as those who were not, and the gods seemed deaf to all prayers and offerings. People who had previously been scrupulous in their religious duties now neglected the temples, reasoning that divine favor clearly offered no protection against the plague. Lawlessness increased, as people reasoned that there was no difference between honor and dishonor when one might not live long enough to be called to account. Why save money for the future when the future might never come? Why deny oneself pleasure when tomorrow might bring the plague to one's own door? The old were not respected, the young were not restrained, traditional hierarchies and customs dissolved in the face of universal terror. Deathbed scenes that should have been solemn and dignified became chaotic and undignified as families fought over inheritances even before the dying had drawn their last breath. The social fabric that held Athens together, woven over generations of shared customs and mutual obligations, began to unravel. This was the crucible in which Plato's mind was formed, a world where the comfortable certainties of his early childhood dissolved like morning mist, where he witnessed the catastrophic failure of the democracy that his ancestor Solon had helped create, where the very idea of divine justice seemed a cruel joke. Is it any wonder that, in later life, he would become obsessed with the question of how to create a just society, how to ensure that wisdom rather than rhetoric should guide the state, how to find some eternal truth that could not be swept away by plague and war and the vicissitudes of fortune? But the plague was only the beginning of Athens's trials. The war ground on year after year, a seemingly endless cycle of campaign seasons and winter truces, of victories that brought no lasting advantage and defeats that could not quite break the city's will to continue. In 425 the Athenians managed to capture a force of Spartan soldiers on the island of Sphacteria, an event that shocked the Greek world. Spartans were not supposed to surrender, ever. It seemed for a moment that Athens might actually win the war. But the advantage was squandered through political infighting and poor strategic decisions. There was a brief interlude of peace, the Peace of Nicias, signed in 421 when Plato was 6 or 7 years old, but it was a fragile thing, a peace in name only, as both sides continued to maneuver and fight through proxies. The underlying tensions that had caused the war remained unresolved, and it was only a matter of time before open conflict resumed. In 415, Athens launched the most ambitious and disastrous military expedition in its history, an attempt to conquer Syracuse, the great city of Sicily. It was a project born of hubris and poor judgment, pushed through the assembly by Alcibiades, that brilliant but unreliable politician who would later prove to be one of the most controversial figures of the age. The expedition was massive, over 100 ships, thousands of soldiers, the flower of Athens's military power. The Athenians dreamed of conquering Sicily, of controlling the grain trade from the west, of surrounding Sparta with subject cities and forcing it to surrender. It ended in total disaster. The Athenian fleet was destroyed in the harbor of Syracuse. Thousands of soldiers were killed in desperate fighting. The survivors were enslaved in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where they died slowly of starvation, disease, and despair. According to Plutarch, some Athenian prisoners earned better treatment by reciting passages from the plays of Euripides to their captors, a testament to the power of culture even in the midst of catastrophe, but a bitter consolation for those who perished in the Sicilian darkness. Plato would have been 12 or 13 when news of the Sicilian disaster reached Athens. Old enough now to fully understand what it meant, that the empire his city had built over decades could crumble in a single catastrophic campaign, that thousands of fathers and sons and brothers would never return home, that Athens's aura of invincibility was shattered forever. The streets must have filled with the wails of the bereaved, as family after family learned that their loved ones were dead or enslaved in a distant land. The political recriminations began immediately, as the democracy sought scapegoats for the disaster, as Alcibiades, who had abandoned the expedition to escape prosecution on religious charges, was condemned in absentia and his property confiscated. And the war continued, growing ever more bitter, ever more desperate. Sparta, now allied with Persia, Athens's ancient enemy, the great power from the east that Greek unity had once defeated, began to systematically dismantle the Athenian empire, peeling away the subject cities one by one. Persian gold financed the building of a Spartan navy that could challenge Athens at sea. Cities that had been forced into the Athenian empire decades earlier saw their chance for freedom and rebelled. Athens's resources were stretched to the breaking point as it tried to maintain its empire, continue the war with Sparta, and deal with internal political turmoil. In 411, when Plato was in his mid-teens, a group of oligarchs staged a coup, briefly overthrowing the democracy and establishing the rule of the 400. This oligarchy lasted only a few months before being replaced by a more moderate government, but it showed how fragile Athenian democracy had become under the stress of prolonged war. The constitution that Solon had created, that Pericles had championed, seemed unable to cope with the demands of total war against a determined enemy. The final blow came in 405, at the Battle of Aegospotami, where the Spartan general Lysander destroyed what remained of the Athenian fleet. With its navy gone, Athens could no longer protect its supply lines or maintain its empire. The Spartans besieged the city, cutting it off from food and supplies. Starvation began to take its toll. There was talk of a last desperate resistance, of fighting to the bitter end rather than surrendering to Sparta's mercy. But in the end, pragmatism prevailed over pride. In 404, Athens surrendered. The terms were harsh but not as catastrophic as some had feared. Athens was allowed to keep its walls, contrary to what Sparta's more extreme allies like Corinth demanded, but the long walls connecting the city to Piraeus were torn down to the sound of flutes, as if this were a moment of celebration rather than catastrophe. The Athenian Empire was dissolved. All foreign possessions were surrendered. The democracy was abolished, and in its place the Spartans installed a puppet government of 30 oligarchs. These 30 tyrants, as they came to be known, included two of Plato's own relatives, his mother's cousin Critias and her brother Charmides. Both were members of the Athenian aristocracy who had long harbored anti-democratic sentiments, who believed that the democracy had been responsible for Athens's disasters, that rule by the many was inherently inferior to rule by the few. At first, perhaps, the young Plato, now in his early 20s, may have felt a glimmer of hope. After all, these were educated men from good families. Surely they would govern more wisely than the mob had done. Surely they would restore order and justice to a city that had been torn apart by years of war and plague. This hope, if he felt it, was quickly and brutally extinguished. The 30 proved to be not philosopher kings but petty despots who used their power to settle old scores, eliminate rivals, and enrich themselves and their supporters. In the 8 months of their rule, they executed without trial some 1,500 Athenians, men whose only crime was being suspected of democratic sympathies or possessing wealth that the 30 coveted. They confiscated property on a massive scale, driving countless others into exile. They established a reign of terror that made the worst excesses of the democracy seem mild by comparison. And they attempted to implicate in their crimes none other than Socrates, the philosopher who had become the most important influence on young Plato's life. Among their attempted victims was Leon of Salamis, a democratic general whom they ordered arrested so that he could be executed without trial and his property confiscated. They commanded 5 men to carry out this arrest, and among them they tried to include Socrates. The philosopher's response was characteristic. He simply went home. He would not participate in judicial murder, regardless of the consequences. It was an act of quiet defiance that could have cost him his life, though in the end, the 30 were overthrown before they could take revenge. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. We must go back to the moment when Plato first encountered the man who would change his life forever, the man whose death would haunt him for the rest of his days, the man through whose words and example Plato would attempt to understand the fundamental questions of existence. Socrates was not a young man when Plato first encountered him. He would have been in his 40s or perhaps early 50s, a stonemason by trade, though he seems to have given up his profession to dedicate himself entirely to philosophy. He was, by all accounts, physically unprepossessing, short, stocky, with a snub nose, bulging eyes, and a pot-belly that his detractors compared to that of a satyr or Silenus. Ancient sources tell us he had thick lips and a wide mouth, that he walked barefoot through the streets regardless of the weather, that he wore the same shabby cloak year-round, refusing to own more than one garment at a time. In a city that valued physical beauty and athletic grace, where aristocrats like Plato cultivated their bodies as carefully as their minds, Socrates was decidedly unglamorous. But those who heard him speak quickly forgot his unprepossessing appearance. Socrates possessed a charisma, an intellectual magnetism, that drew people to him like iron filings to a lodestone. Unlike the sophists, those professional teachers who charged hefty fees to instruct young aristocrats in the arts of rhetoric and persuasion, Socrates claimed to have no wisdom to impart. He knew only that he knew nothing, and his philosophical method consisted not of teaching but of questioning, of forcing his interlocutors to examine their own assumptions and beliefs until the contradictions and confusions became apparent. The story of how Socrates came to this practice of philosophical questioning is one he loved to tell. A friend of his, Chaerephon, had once gone to the oracle at Delphi, that ancient shrine where the priestess of Apollo delivered cryptic prophecies to those who sought divine guidance, and asked if there was anyone wiser than Socrates. The oracle replied that there was not. When Socrates heard this, he was puzzled and disturbed. How could he be the wisest man in Athens when he knew that he knew nothing? The oracle could not be wrong. It was the voice of the god Apollo himself. Yet Socrates was certain that he possessed no special wisdom. So he set out to find someone wiser than himself, to disprove the oracle by discovering a person who truly possessed wisdom. He interviewed the politicians, the men who governed Athens, who made the decisions that affected thousands of lives. Surely these men who held positions of such great responsibility must possess wisdom. But when Socrates questioned them about justice and virtue, about the good and the right, he found that their confident pronouncements dissolved under examination into contradictions and confusions. They thought they knew what justice was, but they could not defend their definitions. They believed they understood virtue but could not explain what it meant or how it could be acquired. He turned next to the poets, the men whose works were celebrated throughout Greece, whose verses were memorized by schoolchildren, whose plays drew thousands to the theater. Surely these men who created such beauty and wisdom in their works must themselves be wise. But when Socrates questioned them about the meaning of their own poetry, he found that they could not explain it. They created beauty through divine inspiration or natural talent, but they did not truly understand what they had created. They were like people who could produce beautiful objects by instinct but could not teach others how to do the same. Finally, he interviewed the craftsmen, the potters and carpenters, the smiths and weavers who created the material goods that sustained civilized life. These men at least possessed genuine knowledge. They knew how to make things and they could teach others their craft. But Socrates found that their expertise in their narrow domain had given them an inflated sense of their wisdom in general. Because they knew how to make a good pot or forge a fine sword, they thought they understood justice and virtue, governance and the good life. Their genuine but limited knowledge had blinded them to their broader ignorance. And so Socrates came to understand the oracle's meaning. He was the wisest man in Athens not because he possessed some great knowledge that others lacked, but because he alone knew that he did not know. The politicians, the poets, the craftsmen, all were ignorant but did not know they were ignorant. Socrates was ignorant but knew it, and this recognition of his own ignorance was the beginning of wisdom. From this realization came Socrates' mission in Athens. He would spend his days in the agora, in the gymnasia, in private homes and public spaces, engaging anyone who would listen in philosophical conversation. He would question the comfortable certainties that people held about virtue and justice, about piety and courage, about knowledge and wisdom. He would expose the contradictions in their thinking, demonstrate that what they thought they knew was actually confused and incoherent. It was uncomfortable, often humiliating work. Being questioned by Socrates was like being stripped naked in public, your intellectual pretensions revealed as the shabby garments they really were. Imagine the scene, if you will, on one of those warm Athenian afternoons when young Plato might first have witnessed Socrates in action. The agora is filled with the usual crowd. Merchants hawking their wares, housewives bargaining for produce, slaves carrying burdens for their masters, politicians and their supporters discussing the latest developments in the assembly. Near one of the colonnades stands Socrates, engaged in conversation with some self-important politician or sophist who has made the mistake of claiming to know what justice is, or what courage means, or how virtue can be taught. The conversation begins innocently enough. Socrates plays the role of the ignorant seeker after knowledge, flattering his target by suggesting that surely someone so distinguished and wise must be able to answer a simple question. What is justice? The politician offers a definition with all the confidence of someone who has never really thought deeply about the question. Justice is giving each man his due, he declares, pleased with this formulation that seems so obviously correct. Socrates nods, pretends to think this over, his bulging eyes blinking slowly as he considers the proposition. But then, and you can almost see the gleam in those unusual eyes, he begins to probe. But what does it mean to give each man his due? The politician elaborates. It means returning what one has borrowed, paying one's debts, fulfilling one's obligations. Socrates nods again, apparently satisfied. But wait, he says as if a thought has just occurred to him. If a friend has lent you weapons and then goes mad, would it be just to return the weapons to him, knowing he might use them to harm himself or others? The politician hesitates. Well, perhaps in that case, one should not return them. So justice is not simply giving each man his due, then? Well, no, not in that case. But then what is justice? The politician offers a revised definition. Socrates finds a new problem with it. Another revision, another problem. The crowd that has gathered to watch begins to murmur and laugh as the politician, who began the conversation so confident in his wisdom, is reduced to confusion and embarrassment. This was the method that came to be known as the elenchus, the Socratic method of inquiry through questioning, of testing definitions and examining beliefs to see if they can withstand logical scrutiny. And it did not make Socrates popular, at least not with those who found themselves on the receiving end of his questions. The young men who followed him around, aristocratic youths like Plato who had the leisure to spend their days in philosophical discussion, found it exhilarating, liberating, to see the pretensions of their elders punctured with such devastating precision. Here was proof that the supposed wisdom of the established authorities was nothing but empty rhetoric and unexamined assumptions. But those elders, the politicians and teachers and self-proclaimed wise men of Athens, they found Socrates infuriating, even dangerous. He made them look foolish in public, undermining their authority in front of the very young men they were supposed to be educating and leading. He encouraged those young men to question everything, to accept nothing on authority, to demand logical justification for every belief and custom. He seemed to care nothing for the traditional values and religious observances that held society together, subjecting even the gods and the ancestral customs to his relentless questioning. For young Plato, Socrates was a revelation. Here was someone who cared nothing for wealth or power or status, who lived simply and thought deeply, who was willing to follow an argument wherever it led without regard for convention or popularity. Here was a man who valued truth above comfort, wisdom above wealth, virtue above success. Plato became one of Socrates' closest followers, part of the inner circle that included Antisthenes, Aristippus, Crito, and others who would go on to found their own philosophical schools or become significant figures in the intellectual life of Athens. They would gather in the gymnasia and the agora, in private homes and public spaces, engaging in those extraordinary conversations that Plato would later recreate in his dialogues. What did they talk about, those young men and their strange teacher? Everything under the sun, but always returning to the central questions that Socrates believed were the most important questions any human being could ask. What is the good? What is virtue? How should one live? Can virtue be taught? What is the nature of justice? What is piety? What is courage? What is knowledge? How can we know anything with certainty? These were not abstract academic questions for Socrates and his followers. In a city torn apart by war and plague, where democracy had given way to oligarchy and seemed incapable of either, where traditional values had collapsed under the weight of catastrophe, these questions felt urgent, vital, as if the very survival of civilization depended on finding the right answers. Socrates had a peculiar belief that set him apart from other philosophers and made him seem even stranger to ordinary Athenians. He claimed to be guided by a daimonion, a divine sign or inner voice that would warn him when he was about to do something wrong. This daimonion never told him what to do, only what not to do, speaking always in the negative. Stay back, do not go that way, do not say that thing. Some of his followers understood this as a kind of intuition or conscience, an internalized sense of right and wrong developed through years of philosophical reflection. But to his enemies, it sounded dangerously like the worship of some new god, some private deity accessible only to Socrates himself, rather than the traditional gods worshipped by all Athenians. There were other aspects of Socrates' teaching that disturbed the traditional-minded. He questioned the value of democracy, suggesting that just as we would not let the majority vote on medical treatment but would defer to the physician's expertise, so too should governance be left to those who truly understood justice and the good, not determined by the untutored opinions of the masses. He suggested that virtue was a kind of knowledge, and that if we truly knew what was good and right, we could not help but do it. A position that seemed to deny the reality of moral weakness and the struggle between reason and passion that everyone experienced. Most troubling of all, perhaps, was his practice of questioning everything, including the existence and nature of the gods. While Socrates himself seems to have been genuinely pious in his own way, he participated in religious rituals, consulted oracles, and believed in some form of divine providence. His relentless questioning made it seem as though nothing was sacred, as though even the gods and the ancestral traditions could be subjected to rational examination and potentially found wanting. And so the years passed, and Plato grew from youth to manhood in the company of this extraordinary teacher. He was there in the agora when Socrates questioned the sophists and the politicians. He was there at the drinking parties, the symposia, where Socrates could drink all night without becoming drunk and still philosophize at dawn. He heard Socrates' theories about the soul, about knowledge as recollection, about the forms that existed beyond the physical world. He witnessed Socrates' iron self-control, his indifference to physical discomfort, his courage in the face of danger. There is a famous story from the symposium, set at a drinking party during the campaign at Potidaea where Plato's brothers distinguished themselves. According to Alcibiades, who tells the story, Socrates once stood in one spot from dawn to dawn, lost in thought, oblivious to the cold and the snow falling around him, immune to the jeers and curiosity of the other soldiers who came to watch this strange philosopher standing motionless through the night. When dawn came, he said a prayer to the sun and went about his business as if nothing unusual had happened. Another story from the same campaign has Socrates saving Alcibiades' life in battle, standing firm when others fled, fighting off the enemy with such skill and courage that the commanders wanted to give him the honors for bravery, honors which Socrates insisted should go to Alcibiades instead. Here was a philosopher who was not merely a talker but a man of action when action was required, someone who could endure hardship, face danger, and meet death with equanimity. But then came the catastrophe of the 30 tyrants, and Socrates' courageous refusal to participate in their crimes. The story of Leon of Salamis became well known in Athens. The 30 had ordered 5 men to go to Salamis and arrest Leon so that he could be executed without trial and his property confiscated. 4 of the 5 obeyed. Socrates simply went home. It was an act of civil disobedience that could have cost him his life, a quiet assertion that there are some things that a good man simply will not do regardless of the consequences. The 30 were overthrown in 403, after ruling for only 8 months. A group of democratic exiles, led by Thrasybulus, launched an attack from Piraeus, and in the resulting battle both Critias and Charmides were killed. Democracy was restored, and an amnesty was declared for political offenses committed during the time of the 30. But the social wounds were deep and would not heal quickly. The returned Democrats had not forgotten who had supported the oligarchs, whose relatives had been among the 30, who had profited from the reign of terror. And there was Socrates, whose association with some of the worst offenders, Critias and Alcibiades especially, was well known throughout Athens. Never mind that Socrates had opposed Critias' crimes and refused to participate in judicial murder. Never mind that he had taught these young men to think for themselves, not to blindly follow his example. The association was enough to make him suspect in the eyes of many. It was also true that Socrates' teaching, with its emphasis on questioning authority and examining traditional beliefs, seemed to some to be responsible for creating the kind of young men who would support oligarchy and betray democracy. Had not many of Socrates' followers been among the oligarchs? Had not his constant questioning of democratic practices and his suggestion that wisdom should rule rather than majority opinion helped create the intellectual climate that made the 30 possible? 4 years after the restoration of democracy, in the year 399, when Plato was around 28 years old, 3 men brought charges against Socrates. The primary accuser was Meletus, a minor poet who seems to have had some personal grievance against Socrates. He was supported by Anytus, a prominent democratic politician who had been among those who overthrew the 30 and restored democracy, and Lyco, a rhetorician. The charges were twofold: failing to acknowledge the gods that the city acknowledges and introducing new deities, and corrupting the youth of Athens. These were capital offenses, and Socrates, now 70 years old, was put on trial before a jury of 500 Athenian citizens, selected by lot from the citizen body. The trial took place on a single day, as was customary in Athens. Each side was given 3 hours to present its case, measured by a water clock, a large vessel with a hole in the bottom through which water dripped steadily, marking the passage of time. We have 2 accounts of Socrates' defense, one by Plato, one by Xenophon, another of Socrates' followers. The 2 accounts differ in details, but they agree on the essential point: Socrates made no real attempt to save himself. Rather than appealing to the jury's emotions, bringing his wife and children before them to beg for mercy, admitting guilt and promising to reform, Socrates used his trial as an opportunity to continue philosophizing, to defend not just himself but his entire way of life. He addressed the charges head-on, with a logic and clarity that must have been simultaneously admirable and infuriating to the jurors. He did not, he insisted, disbelieve in the gods. How could he, when he claimed to be guided by a divine voice, his daimonion? The charge was contradictory. How could one simultaneously not believe in gods and introduce new gods? As for corrupting the youth, who were these corrupted youths? His accusers could not name them. If he had truly corrupted young men, where were their fathers and older brothers demanding satisfaction? Instead, there sat in the courtroom many of those very young men, now grown to adulthood, and their families who supported Socrates. The real reason he was being prosecuted, Socrates suggested with characteristic bluntness, was because he had made powerful enemies by exposing the ignorance of those who thought themselves wise. He had been following the command of the god Apollo, as revealed through the oracle at Delphi, to pursue wisdom and to help others pursue it. He had spent his life trying to make his fellow Athenians better people, encouraging them to care for their souls rather than merely for wealth and reputation. How could that be impious or corrupt? When it came time for the jury to vote on his guilt or innocence, the verdict was surprisingly close. Perhaps 280 voted to convict, 220 to acquit. It was not the overwhelming condemnation one might have expected given the political climate and the suspicions surrounding Socrates. But it was enough for conviction. Under Athenian law, in a case where the penalty was not fixed by statute, both the prosecution and the defense would propose a punishment, and the jury would choose between them. The prosecutors proposed death by drinking hemlock, the standard method of execution for Athenian citizens convicted of capital crimes. What would Socrates propose as an alternative? In his most provocative moment, the moment that perhaps sealed his fate more decisively than the original charges, Socrates suggested that instead of being punished, he should be given free meals for life in the Prytaneum, an honor usually reserved for Olympic victors, war heroes, and great benefactors of the city. After all, he argued with devastating logic, he had spent his life improving his fellow citizens at great personal cost, neglecting his own affairs, living in poverty, all to pursue wisdom and help others do the same. Surely such service deserved reward rather than punishment. The jurors were outraged by this display of what they saw as arrogance and contempt for their authority. When Plato and other followers urged Socrates to propose a fine instead, he reluctantly agreed, suggesting 1 mina of silver, about a fifth of his modest net worth, an amount that demonstrated his poverty as much as his willingness to compromise. His supporters offered to increase this to 30 minae, but it was too late. The damage was done. When the jury voted again, this time to choose between death and the fine, the majority for death was even larger than the majority for conviction had been, perhaps 360 votes to 140. Many jurors who had voted for acquittal initially now voted for death, convinced by Socrates' apparent arrogance that he deserved the ultimate penalty. Socrates accepted the verdict calmly, even cheerfully. He told the jurors that for a man of 70, death was no great evil. Indeed, it might be a blessing, either a dreamless sleep, peaceful and undisturbed, without the fears and sorrows that plague our waking hours, or else a journey to another place where he might continue his philosophical inquiries among the noble dead, questioning Hesiod and Homer about the meaning of their poems, examining Agamemnon and Odysseus and Achilles about virtue and courage and the meaning of honor. He warned his condemners that by silencing him, they had not escaped criticism. Others would arise to take his place, younger men more vigorous in their questioning, and the Athenians would find that they had only made their situation worse by executing an old man who would have died soon anyway. But the sentence could not be carried out immediately. By a stroke of fate that would give Socrates' followers one last month with their teacher, the day before the trial, Athens had sent its annual sacred ship to Delos to honor Apollo. According to religious law, no executions could take place in Athens while the ship was at sea. That year, the winds were unfavorable, and the voyage that usually took a week or two stretched to 30 days. For a month, Socrates remained in prison, and each day his followers came to visit him. They found him in good spirits, engaging in philosophical discussions as if he were in the agora rather than a prison cell awaiting execution. Crito, one of his oldest friends, came with an offer to help him escape. Everything was arranged, the guards had been bribed, a ship was waiting to take him to exile in Thessaly, his friends would provide for his needs. All Socrates had to do was agree. But Socrates refused. In the dialogue that Plato wrote about this conversation, Socrates explains his reasoning with impeccable logic. To escape would be to break the laws of Athens. He has lived his entire life in Athens, accepted its protections and benefits, participated in its community. He has had ample opportunity to leave if he disagreed with its laws, but he has chosen to stay. By remaining, he has entered into an implicit agreement to obey the city's laws, even when those laws work to his disadvantage. Moreover, if he escapes now, he will be admitting that his philosophy was mere talk, that he did not truly believe the things he had taught all his life about justice and obedience to law. How can he have spent decades telling young men that they must be just and law-abiding, that virtue is the most important thing in life, and then flee into exile to save his skin? No, better to die in accordance with his principles than to live having betrayed them. There is another consideration too, though Socrates does not emphasize it in Plato's account. If he escapes, the authorities will likely take revenge on those who helped him, on Crito and the other friends who arranged his escape, on their families and property. By accepting his sentence, Socrates protects those he loves from the consequences of his actions. And so the days passed, and Socrates' followers visited him in prison, engaging in those profound philosophical conversations that Plato would later immortalize in his dialogues. They discussed the immortality of the soul, the nature of the afterlife, the relationship between body and soul, the forms that exist beyond the physical world. It was as if Socrates was giving his followers a final intensive course in philosophy, preparing them to continue his work after his death. Plato was among the regular visitors, though he tells us through Phaedo, who narrates the dialogue, that he was absent on the final day due to illness. But he gave us, in his dialogue the Phaedo, what purports to be an eyewitness account of those final hours, based on the testimony of those who were present. Whether or not every detail is historically accurate, and scholars debate this extensively, the account captures something essential about Socrates' character and his approach to death. The dialogue is set in Socrates' cell on that last morning. His friends have gathered, Phaedo, Simmias, Cebes, Apollodorus, Crito and others. Socrates' wife Xantippe is there too, with their infant son. Socrates had married late in life, and his youngest child was still a baby. But when the philosophical conversation is about to begin, Socrates asks Crito to send her home. She departs in tears and then the discussion begins. They talk about death and the immortality of the soul, about whether there is anything to fear in dying, about what, if anything, survives the destruction of the body. Socrates proposes various arguments for why the soul must be immortal. The soul is simple and incomposite, unlike the body which is complex and can be broken down into its constituent elements. The soul partakes of the forms which are eternal and unchanging, and therefore must itself be eternal. The soul is the principle of life itself, and therefore cannot admit of death without ceasing to be what it is. It is philosophy itself, Socrates suggests, that is the best preparation for death. The philosopher spends his life trying to separate the soul from the body, to turn away from physical pleasures and pains toward contemplation of eternal truths. Physical death is simply the final and complete separation of soul from body that the philosopher has been practicing throughout his life. Why should the philosopher fear what he has been working toward all along? As the sun climbs higher in the sky, marking the hours until sunset when the execution must take place, the conversation continues. They examine objections to Socrates' arguments, consider alternatives, refine their positions. It is quintessential Socratic dialogue, questioning, examining, testing ideas to see if they can withstand logical scrutiny. The jailer comes in the afternoon with apologetic embarrassment. He has come to know Socrates during this month, visiting him daily as part of his duties, and he declares him the noblest and gentlest man who has ever been his prisoner. He weeps as he tells Socrates to drink the poison when he is ready, that the sun is low in the sky and the time has come. Socrates comforts him kindly, praising him for his humanity, telling him not to mourn but to prepare the hemlock. The poison is brought, hemlock extract from the plant Conium maculatum, ground and mixed into a liquid. Hemlock was the standard method of execution in Athens for citizens convicted of capital crimes, considered more humane than crucifixion or strangulation, allowing the condemned to die with some dignity rather than in agony or humiliation. Socrates takes the cup without hesitation, his hand steady, examining it with the same philosophical curiosity he has brought to every aspect of life. He asks if he can pour a libation to the gods from the cup, as was customary before drinking wine. The jailer explains that they prepared only enough poison for the fatal dose, so no liquid can be spared. Socrates understands and simply prays that his passage from this world to the next will be fortunate. Then he lifts the cup to his lips and drinks it down calmly, even cheerfully, without flinching or grimacing, though those who have tasted hemlock say it is bitter and unpleasant. His friends, who have maintained their composure throughout the day, finally break down in tears. Socrates rebukes them gently. He has sent the women away precisely to avoid such emotional displays, he says. They should be quiet and brave. Philosophical men do not fear death but accept it as a natural transition. He walks around for a while as instructed by the jailer, until his legs begin to feel heavy. Then he lies down on his back, covering himself with a cloak. The jailer periodically checks on him, pinching his feet and legs to test for sensation. Socrates reports with philosophical interest on the progress of the poison through his body, as if conducting an experiment on himself. The numbness begins in his feet and spreads slowly upward. His legs grow cold and heavy. The sensation of paralysis climbs past his knees, reaches his thighs, moves into his abdomen. All the while he continues speaking with his friends about the soul's journey after death, about the importance of virtue, about the philosophical life. Even as his body fails, his mind remains clear and sharp, engaged in the pursuit of wisdom until the very end. When the poison reaches his lower abdomen, Socrates speaks his last words, a strange request that has puzzled interpreters for 24 centuries. Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepius. Don't forget to pay the debt. Asclepius was the god of healing, and a rooster was a standard offering made in thanks for recovery from illness. Was Socrates suggesting that death was the cure for the illness of life, that in dying he was being healed of the disease of embodied existence? Was he referring to some actual debt he had incurred, perhaps when he recovered from the plague decades earlier? Was it a cryptic philosophical message about the nature of life and death? We will never know, and perhaps that is fitting, that Socrates' last words should be as enigmatic as so much of his teaching, inviting endless interpretation and debate. A moment later, his body gives a slight movement, a convulsion. The jailer uncovers his face, which Socrates had asked to be veiled. His eyes are fixed and staring, the light gone from them. Crito gently closes his eyes and mouth, performing the final offices for the dead. Such was the end, Plato would later write in his account, of our friend, a man who, we would say, was of all those we have known the best, and also the wisest and the most just. The execution of Socrates in 399 was the defining trauma of Plato's life, the wound that would never quite heal, the injustice that would drive all his subsequent thinking about politics and philosophy. Here was a man who had harmed no one, whose only crime was to question people too insistently, to expose their pretensions to wisdom, to encourage young men to think for themselves. And the democracy, his city, his home, the political system that his ancestor Solon had helped create, had murdered him. And not quickly, not in the heat of passion or revolutionary violence, but deliberately after due process of law, with 500 citizens voting to kill their wisest member. The implications were staggering. If the democracy could kill Socrates, if the majority could vote to execute a man for asking questions and pursuing wisdom, then something was fundamentally wrong with democracy itself. The problem was not just the particular political circumstances of Athens in 399, the aftermath of the 30 tyrants, the political tensions, the personal grudges of Socrates' accusers. The problem was deeper, structural, inherent in the very nature of democratic governance. How can the many who have not devoted their lives to the pursuit of wisdom make sound judgments about complex questions of justice and virtue? How can people who have spent their lives pursuing wealth and pleasure and reputation suddenly become wise judges when they enter the assembly or the courtroom? Democracy assumes that every citizen is equally qualified to make political decisions, but this assumption is clearly false. We do not let the majority vote on whether a ship is seaworthy, we ask the expert shipbuilder. We do not have a popular assembly decide whether a patient needs surgery, we consult the physician. Why then should we let the untrained masses decide questions of justice and good governance, which are far more complex and important than shipbuilding or medicine? These were the questions that tormented Plato in the aftermath of Socrates' death. In the immediate aftermath, he left Athens. He may have feared for his own safety. After all, he was closely associated with Socrates, and his own relatives had been among the hated 30 tyrants. But more than fear, perhaps, was grief and disillusionment. The city that had nurtured him, the democracy his ancestor had helped create, had shown itself capable of the grossest injustice. He needed distance, time to think, to process what had happened and figure out what it meant. He traveled first to Megara, a nearby city where another of Socrates' followers, Euclides, had established a philosophical school. There he spent time discussing philosophy with other survivors of Socrates' circle, working through their shared grief and trying to understand what had happened. Then in the years that followed he journeyed more widely, to Egypt perhaps, where he may have studied with the priests and learned of their ancient wisdom, their mathematical and astronomical knowledge that dated back thousands of years, to Cyrene in North Africa, where he may have studied mathematics with Theodorus, and most significantly to southern Italy and Sicily, where he would encounter ideas and people that would shape his thinking for the rest of his life. It was in southern Italy, in the cities of Magna Graecia, that Plato encountered the followers of Pythagoras. Pythagoras himself had died nearly a century earlier, sometime around 490, but his philosophical and mathematical school continued in cities like Tarentum and Croton. The Pythagoreans were unlike any philosophers Plato had encountered in Athens. They combined rigorous mathematical investigation with religious mysticism, scientific inquiry with spiritual practice. They believed in the transmigration of souls, in reincarnation, in the idea that the soul was immortal and would be reborn again and again until it achieved purification. From the Pythagoreans, Plato learned to see the world through the lens of mathematics, to understand that beneath the chaotic flux of physical reality lay an eternal order expressible in numbers and geometric forms. The Pythagoreans had discovered the mathematical ratios underlying musical harmony, that a string vibrating at twice the frequency of another produces a note 1 octave higher, that the perfect fifth corresponds to a 3:2 ratio, that the perfect fourth is 4:3. These were not arbitrary cultural conventions but eternal mathematical truths, and they suggested that the cosmos itself was structured according to mathematical principles. This insight would prove crucial for Plato's developing philosophy. If there were eternal mathematical truths that existed independently of the physical world, might there not also be eternal ethical and metaphysical truths? Might justice and beauty and goodness be as real and unchanging as the ratio between the sides of a right triangle? This idea would develop into Plato's famous theory of forms, but its seeds were planted during these years studying with the Pythagoreans in southern Italy. He absorbed their belief in the immortality and transmigration of souls, their ascetic practices aimed at purifying the soul from the contamination of bodily existence, their conviction that the pursuit of wisdom was the highest human calling and that philosophers should live apart from the corrupting influences of ordinary political life. The Pythagorean communities were organized almost like monasteries, with members sharing property, following strict dietary rules, practicing silence and contemplation. While Plato would never adopt all these practices himself, the idea that philosophers should live differently from ordinary people, that they should be set apart by their dedication to wisdom, would influence his thinking about the ideal state. In Sicily, Plato became involved in the court of Dionysius I, the tyrant of Syracuse, the most powerful Greek city in the western Mediterranean. He also befriended Dion, the tyrant's brother-in-law, a young man of philosophical bent who became Plato's devoted follower and friend. According to later accounts, whose reliability is disputed, Dionysius became displeased with Plato's philosophical teachings and his implied criticism of tyranny. Whether Dionysius actually had Plato sold into slavery, as some ancient sources claim, or whether Plato simply fell out of favor and left Syracuse under less dramatic circumstances, we cannot know for certain. What is clear is that Plato's first Sicilian adventure ended badly, and he returned to Athens around 387, his mind filled with ideas about how philosophy might be used to transform politics and create a better society. Back in Athens, now around 40 years old, Plato founded what would become the most famous educational institution in the ancient world, the Academy. He purchased a plot of land near a grove sacred to the hero Academus, about a mile outside the city walls, northwest of the Agora. The grove already contained a gymnasium, one of those public spaces where Athenian men would gather to exercise, bathe and socialize. Plato's property included gardens and buildings that could serve as gathering places for his students. The Academy was not a university in the modern sense. There were no formal courses, no degrees granted, no tuition charged. Students did not enroll for a fixed period and then graduate. It was more like a community of scholars, men and a few women, unusual for the time, united by their love of wisdom and their commitment to following arguments wherever they might lead. But it was still revolutionary. Before Plato, philosophy in Athens had been practiced by individual teachers. Socrates engaging people in the Agora, the sophists offering private instruction for fees. Plato created instead an institutional home for philosophy, a place where research could be conducted, where ideas could be debated and refined over years and decades, where a body of shared knowledge could accumulate and be transmitted to future generations. One of the first things Plato did after acquiring the property was to establish a shrine dedicated to the 9 muses, the goddesses of literature, science, and the arts. This shrine, called a mauseon, from which our word museum derives, served both a religious and an educational function. It marked the Academy as a place devoted to learning and culture, under the protection and inspiration of the Muses. It also gave the Academy a quasi-religious status, which may have provided some legal protection in a city that could be suspicious of new educational ventures. The course of study at the Academy reflected Plato's conviction that mathematics was the key to understanding reality. According to later sources, an inscription over the entrance to the Academy read, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." Whether or not this inscription actually existed, ancient sources are contradictory on this point. It captures something essential about Plato's educational philosophy. Students would begin with arithmetic and geometry, learning the properties of numbers and shapes, discovering the mathematical truths that exist independently of the physical world. They would study astronomy, not the practical astronomy of sailors and farmers, but theoretical astronomy that sought to understand the mathematical principles governing the movements of the heavenly bodies. They would study harmonics, the mathematical analysis of music and the ratios that produce consonance and dissonance. All of this mathematical training was preparation for the most important subject, philosophy itself, particularly dialectic, the art of logical argument and discussion that Socrates had practiced. The curriculum was demanding and lengthy. According to the Republic, which describes an ideal educational system that may reflect Plato's vision for the Academy, students would spend 10 years studying mathematics before being allowed to begin the study of dialectic. Then they would spend 5 years learning to engage in philosophical argument, to defend positions, to analyze and criticize assumptions. Finally, having completed this theoretical education, they would spend 15 years gaining practical experience in the world before returning to full-time philosophical contemplation. The actual practice at the academy was probably less rigidly structured than this ideal curriculum suggests, but the emphasis on mathematics and dialectic was real. Plato attracted students from throughout the Greek world. Men who would travel to Athens specifically to study at the academy, living in the city for years, participating in the discussions and debates that were the heart of the academy's educational method. The teaching at the academy was based on dialogue and discussion rather than lectures. While Plato himself was the central figure, other members contributed to the debates. Students would pose questions, defend positions, challenge each other's arguments. The goal was not to transmit a fixed body of doctrine but to train students to think philosophically, to examine assumptions, to follow arguments wherever they led, to pursue truth rather than victory in debate. Among the students who came to study at the academy was a young man from Stagira in northern Greece named Aristotle. He arrived around 367 when he was 17 years old, and would remain at the academy for 20 years until Plato's death. Aristotle would become Plato's most famous student, and in many ways his greatest critic, developing a philosophical system that would rival his teachers in scope and influence. But that is a story for another time. At the academy, Plato continued to write his philosophical dialogues, those extraordinary works that combine dramatic literature with rigorous philosophical argument. The dialogues feature Socrates as the main character, engaging in philosophical discussions with various interlocutors. Through these dialogues, Plato explored the great questions that had obsessed him since Socrates' death. What is justice? What is the good? How should we live? What kind of political system would produce the best society? The dialogues are works of genius that operate on multiple levels simultaneously. They are dramatic literature with vivid characterizations and compelling plots. They are philosophical arguments, examining ideas with logical rigor. They are pedagogical tools, teaching readers how to think philosophically rather than just what to think. And they are, perhaps, memorials to Socrates, preserving his method and his spirit for future generations. Plato never appears as a character in his own dialogues. Unlike other philosophers who wrote treatises stating their views directly, Plato always speaks through characters, particularly through Socrates. This creates a peculiar problem for interpreters. Which views expressed in the dialogues represent Plato's own beliefs, and which are merely positions being examined and tested? Scholars have debated this question for centuries without reaching consensus. What is clear is that certain ideas appear repeatedly in the dialogues and seem to be central to Plato's philosophical vision. Chief among these is the theory of forms, the idea that there exists a realm of perfect, eternal, unchanging entities of which the things we perceive with our senses are merely imperfect copies. The forms are Plato's solution to a problem that had vexed Greek philosophy for generations. How can there be knowledge in a world where everything is constantly changing? Heraclitus had taught that everything flows, that you cannot step into the same river twice because new waters are ever flowing around you. All things are in flux, nothing remains the same. But if that is true, how can we know anything? Knowledge requires stability, permanence. If the object of knowledge is always changing, then what we thought we knew a moment ago may no longer be true. Plato's solution was to posit two worlds. The visible world of physical objects that we perceive with our senses, subject to constant change and decay, and the intelligible world of forms that we can grasp only with the mind, eternal and unchanging. The forms are perfect templates or patterns of which the things we see around us are merely imperfect copies. There is, for example, a form of the horse, an ideal, perfect horse that exists in some non-physical realm, accessible not to the senses but to reason. All the individual horses we encounter in the world participate in or imitate this form, but they are imperfect copies. They are born, age, and die, while the form of the horse is eternal and unchanging. This applies not just to physical objects but to abstract concepts as well. There is a form of justice, a form of beauty, a form of courage, a form of goodness. When we call something just or beautiful or good, we are recognizing that it participates, however imperfectly, in these eternal forms. And the highest form, the one that illuminates all the others and makes them possible, is the form of the good, the ultimate source of reality and truth, comparable in the intelligible realm to what the sun is in the visible realm. This theory had profound implications that ramified through every aspect of Plato's philosophy. It meant that true knowledge was not knowledge of the physical world, that was mere opinion, as unreliable as the shifting objects of sense perception. True knowledge was knowledge of the forms, achieved not through the senses but through reason and philosophical contemplation. It meant that the soul was more real than the body, for the soul was akin to the forms, simple, eternal, unchanging in its essential nature, while the body was merely physical, composite, perishable. It meant that the philosopher, who had trained himself to turn away from the deceptions of the senses and contemplate eternal truths, had a kind of knowledge that ordinary people lacked, a wisdom that qualified him uniquely to lead and govern. Plato illustrated these ideas through a series of memorable images and analogies that have become among the most famous passages in Western philosophy. In the Republic, he presents the divided line, which represents the different levels of reality and knowledge. At the bottom is imagination and conjecture, dealing with mere shadows and images. Above that is belief, dealing with physical objects. Higher still is mathematical reasoning, dealing with abstract relationships. And at the top is dialectical understanding, the direct apprehension of the forms themselves. He offers the analogy of the sun, comparing the form of the good to the sun in the visible world. Just as the sun makes physical objects visible and provides the light by which we see them, so the form of the good makes the forms intelligible and provides the illumination by which we understand them. Just as the sun is the source of growth and nourishment in the visible world, so the form of the good is the source of being and truth in the intelligible world. But the most famous illustration of Plato's philosophy is the allegory of the cave, which appears in the 7th book of the Republic. Imagine, Plato says through the voice of Socrates, a group of prisoners who have been chained in a cave since childhood, unable to turn their heads, forced to stare at the wall in front of them. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway along which people carry various objects, statues of animals and humans, everyday items. These objects cast shadows on the wall that the prisoners face. For these prisoners, the shadows are reality. They have never seen anything else. They give names to the different shadows, they note which shadows typically appear together or in sequence, they develop elaborate theories about shadow behavior. The best among them, those who can most accurately predict which shadow will appear next, are honored as wise and given positions of authority in the cave. But now imagine that one prisoner is freed. He is forced to stand up, to turn around, to look at the fire. At first, he is confused and in pain. The fire hurts his eyes, accustomed to dim shadows. The real objects seem less real to him than the shadows because his eyes cannot yet properly perceive them. He wants to turn back to the comfortable darkness, the familiar shadows that he understands. But he is dragged further, up a steep and rough passage, out of the cave entirely, into the sunlight of the upper world. At first, the light is completely overwhelming. He cannot look at anything directly. He can only look at shadows and reflections in water. Even in the upper world, he must begin with shadows before he can perceive real objects. Gradually, painfully, his eyes adjust. He begins to see the actual objects that cast the shadows. He sees trees and animals, houses and people. He can look at the stars and moon at night. Finally, after a long process of adjustment and education, he can look at the sun itself and understand that this is what provides light and makes vision possible, what causes the seasons and governs everything in the visible realm. This prisoner, having ascended to true knowledge, having seen reality as it truly is, might feel obligated to return to the cave to free his fellow prisoners, to share with them the knowledge he has gained. He descends back into the darkness. But his eyes, now accustomed to the brilliant sunlight, cannot see in the dim cave. He stumbles around blindly while the other prisoners, who never left, can still see the shadows perfectly well. They mock him, saying that his journey upward has ruined his vision. Why would anyone want to leave the cave if it makes you blind? If he tries to free them, to drag them upward into the painful light, they will resist violently. They are comfortable in their chains, familiar with their shadows. The unknown world outside terrifies them. They might even kill him to prevent being freed, just as Athens killed Socrates for trying to enlighten his fellow citizens. The allegory is rich with meaning that operates on multiple levels. The cave represents the world of physical appearances, the realm of becoming that we take to be reality but which is actually just shadows of truth. The prisoners are ordinary people who have never questioned their perceptions, who take the world of the senses to be the real world. The fire represents the sun in our visible world, a physical source of light but not the true light. The journey upward is the ascent of the soul toward knowledge of the forms, a difficult and painful process of education that requires turning away from comfortable illusions. The sun in the upper world represents the form of the good, the ultimate source of truth and reality. And the philosopher who returns to the cave is Socrates himself, attempting to enlighten his fellow Athenians, mocked for his trouble and ultimately killed for his efforts to free them from their chains. But the allegory also reveals Plato's evolving political vision, the answer he had developed to the question that had haunted him since Socrates' execution. How can society be organized to prevent the kinds of injustices that killed Socrates? For if most people are trapped in the cave, seeing only shadows and taking them for reality, how can they possibly govern themselves wisely? Democracy, which gives equal political power to the ignorant and the enlightened, to those who see only shadows and those who have glimpsed the sun, is a recipe for disaster. The death of Socrates was proof of that. No, the ideal state, the just state, would be one governed by those who have made the ascent from the cave, who have come to know the forms, especially the form of the good. These philosopher kings would rule not for their own benefit but for the good of all, because they alone understand what true goodness is. They would be free from the delusions of wealth and power that corrupt ordinary rulers, for they have seen that the physical world, including material riches and political prestige, is merely a shadow of true reality. In the Republic, Plato sketched out his vision of this ideal state in elaborate detail. Society would be divided into three classes, corresponding to the three parts of the soul that Plato identified: reason, spirit, and appetite. The producers, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, corresponded to the appetitive part of the soul, concerned with meeting bodily needs and desires. The auxiliaries, warriors and guardians of the state, corresponded to the spirited part of the soul, the source of courage, anger, and competitive drive. And the rulers, the philosopher kings, corresponded to the rational part of the soul, which should govern both spirit and appetite, directing them toward what is truly good. Each class would receive an education appropriate to its function and nature. The producers would learn their trades and crafts, developing the skills necessary for economic life. The auxiliaries would receive extensive physical and military training, learning music and poetry to instill proper values, developing the courage and discipline needed to defend the state. They would be taught from childhood to value honor over wealth, to be willing to sacrifice personal interest for the good of the community, to face death without fear. But the future philosopher kings would receive the most rigorous education of all, a curriculum that would span 50 years before they were ready to rule. They would begin with the same physical and musical training as the auxiliaries, developing healthy bodies and harmonious souls. But then, if they showed sufficient aptitude and promise, they would advance to 10 years of mathematical study, arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, harmonics. This would train them to think abstractly, to see the eternal patterns beneath physical appearances, to understand that there are truths that can be known with certainty through reason alone. Then would come 5 years of dialectic, learning to engage in philosophical argument, to defend positions rationally, to analyze and criticize assumptions. This was the most dangerous part of education, Plato warned, because young people exposed to dialectic before they were ready often became nihilists, using their newly acquired argumentative skills to tear down all beliefs without building anything in their place. But for those who had been properly prepared by mathematical training and had reached sufficient maturity, dialectic was the culmination of education, the method by which one could ascend from particular instances to universal truths, from the visible world to the intelligible realm. Finally, at the age of 35, having completed their theoretical education, these philosopher candidates would spend 15 years in the real world, serving in minor governmental and military positions, testing their characters, seeing whether they would remain true to their philosophical education or be corrupted by the temptations of power and wealth. Some would fail this test and remain in these subordinate positions. Others would prove themselves worthy of the highest calling. Only at 50 years old, having proven themselves over decades of study and service, would they be ready to rule. And even then, they would do so reluctantly, for they would prefer to spend their time in philosophical contemplation of the forms rather than dealing with the messy business of governing. They would rule not from ambition or desire for power, but from duty, because they alone possessed the knowledge necessary to create a just state, and because those who do not desire power are precisely the ones who should have it. To ensure that these guardians and rulers would govern for the common good rather than their own private interests, Plato proposed radical measures that have shocked and disturbed readers for over 2 millennia. They would own no private property, living instead in common housing and eating at common messes like soldiers in a military camp. They would have no families in the traditional sense. Marriages would be arranged by the state for eugenic purposes, to breed the best possible guardians. Sexual relationships outside these state-sponsored unions would be forbidden. Children would be raised communally, not knowing their own parents, eliminating the nepotism and dynasticism that corrupted ordinary states. It was a vision at once inspiring and terrifying, inspiring in its conviction that wisdom and virtue could triumph over ignorance and vice, that a truly just society was possible if only it were organized rationally according to philosophical principles, terrifying in its willingness to subordinate individual freedom and family bonds to the collective good, to regulate every aspect of life according to philosophical principles, to give absolute power to an elite who claims special knowledge of eternal truths. Critics have attacked Plato's Republic from every angle. Some see it as proto-totalitarian, a blueprint for dictatorship disguised as philosophy. Others argue that it is not meant as a practical political program at all, but rather as an extended metaphor for the soul and its proper ordering. Some focus on the abolition of the family among the guardians, seeing it as an attack on the most fundamental human bonds. Others criticize the idea that knowledge of abstract forms could qualify someone to govern, arguing that politics requires practical wisdom that cannot be gained through contemplation alone. But whatever one thinks of Plato's specific proposals, the Republic remains one of the most influential works in the history of political philosophy. It forced people to think systematically about the best form of government, to ask what justice really means, to consider whether might makes right or whether there are moral truths that transcend power politics. It introduced concepts and arguments that would shape political debate for millennia. The idea that leaders should be selected based on merit rather than birth or wealth, that education is essential for good citizenship, that the purpose of government is not just to maintain order but to promote virtue, that political legitimacy comes from serving the common good rather than the interests of the rulers. Plato spent the rest of his life at the academy, developing and refining his philosophical system, writing his dialogues, teaching his students. But he could not entirely give up his dream of putting philosophy into practice, of creating a real state governed by wisdom rather than mere opinion. This dream would lead him back to Sicily, to two more dangerous adventures that would nearly cost him his life. In 367, Dionysius I died and was succeeded by his son, Dionysius II. Dion, Plato's friend and student, saw an opportunity. The young tyrant might be educated to become a philosopher king, might transform Syracuse into a model of enlightened governance. Dion urged Plato to return to Sicily to undertake this educational project. Plato was reluctant. He was now 60 years old, comfortable in his work at the academy, under no illusions about how difficult it would be to turn a tyrant into a philosopher. But Dion was insistent and Plato felt obligated to at least try. If he could succeed, if he could create even one state governed by philosophical principles, it would validate everything he had taught and written. And if he refused, how could he ever again speak with authority about politics and governance when he had declined the opportunity to put his ideas into practice? So Plato returned to Syracuse. At first things seemed promising. The young Dionysius showed interest in philosophy, attended Plato's lectures, engaged in philosophical discussions. But he lacked the discipline and dedication necessary for genuine philosophical education. He wanted the prestige of being associated with a famous philosopher without doing the hard work of actually becoming wise. He was impatient with the long preliminary studies in mathematics that Plato insisted were necessary before one could begin studying philosophy proper. More seriously, Dionysius grew suspicious of Dion, his uncle and Plato's friend. Dion was popular, respected, potentially a threat to Dionysius's power. Court intriguers whispered that Dion was using Plato to gain influence, that he planned to overthrow Dionysius and seize power for himself. In 366, Dionysius expelled Dion from Syracuse, confiscating his property and forcing him into exile. Plato tried repeatedly to reconcile the two, to convince Dionysius to allow Dion to return, to resume the philosophical education that had barely begun. But Dionysius was interested in philosophy only as an ornament to his rule, not as a genuine guide for living or governing. After a year of frustration and disappointment, Plato gave up and returned to Athens. But he made one more attempt. In 361, at the age of 66, Plato returned to Syracuse a third time. This visit was even more disastrous than the second. Dionysius kept Plato virtually prisoner in Syracuse, refusing to let him leave. Plato appealed to his friend Archytas, the Pythagorean philosopher who had considerable influence in the region. Archytas sent a ship to Syracuse demanding Plato's release, and Dionysius, not wanting to antagonize a powerful ally, let him go. Plato returned to Athens in 360, and this time he stayed for the remaining years of his life. The Sicilian adventures were over, the dream of the philosopher king definitively abandoned. Dion would eventually return to Syracuse with a military force, overthrow Dionysius II, and rule briefly before being assassinated by a former associate. The whole sad story confirmed what Plato had perhaps suspected all along. that in the real world of politics, philosophy and power do not easily mix, that wisdom is not enough to guarantee just governance, that even the best intentions can be corrupted by the realities of political life. Back at the academy, Plato continued his work, but his thinking began to shift. In his later dialogues, written in the years after his final return from Sicily, he took a more realistic, less idealistic approach to political philosophy. The Statesman and the Laws, his last major works, present a vision of the best achievable state rather than the perfect ideal state of the Republic. In the Laws, which Plato was still working on when he died and which was published posthumously by one of his students, there are no philosopher kings, no communism of wives and property, no breeding programs to create ideal guardians. Instead, Plato describes a mixed constitution incorporating elements of monarchy and democracy, governed by detailed laws designed to promote virtue among the citizens. There is extensive regulation of education, of religious practice, of economic activity, all aimed at creating citizens who are moderate, pious, and law-abiding. But there is also recognition that human beings are fallible, that even the best laws and institutions cannot create perfect justice, that we must settle for the best we can achieve rather than holding out for an impossible ideal. It is a sobering, mature vision from a man who had spent decades thinking about politics and justice, who had seen his greatest teacher executed by democracy, who had witnessed his own relatives participate in oligarchic tyranny, who had tried and failed to create a philosopher king in Syracuse. The youthful idealism of the Republic has given way to a more pragmatic recognition of human limitations. But the underlying conviction remains, that knowledge matters, that wisdom should guide politics, that the examined life is better than the unexamined life, that philosophy has something essential to contribute to the organization of human society. Plato died in 347 BCE, at the age of 80 or 81. According to some accounts, he died peacefully at a wedding feast, celebrating the marriage of one of his relatives or students. According to others, he was working on the laws when death came. We do not know which account is true, and perhaps it does not matter. Either way, he died as he had lived for the past 60 years. Engaged with philosophy, part of a community, thinking and teaching until the very end. The academy continued for centuries after his death, becoming not just a center for philosophy but for mathematics and astronomy as well. Plato's student Speusippus succeeded him as head of the academy, followed by a series of successors who would guide the institution through various phases and transformations. The academy went through what historians call the Middle Academy and the New Academy, periods when it turned toward skepticism, questioning whether certain knowledge was even possible. Eventually it returned to a form of dogmatism more in line with Plato's original vision, though inevitably changed and developed by centuries of philosophical debate. The academy itself survived in one form or another, for nearly 1,000 years. In 86 BCE, during the Roman siege of Athens, much of the academy was destroyed, and there was a gap in continuity. But a revived academy was established in the early 5th century CE, becoming a center for Neoplatonism under philosophers like Proclus. Finally, in 529 CE, the Emperor Justinian closed it along with the other pagan philosophical schools, seeing them as threats to Christianity. But even that closure could not destroy Plato's influence. His works had been preserved, studied, commented upon, translated into Latin and Arabic. Medieval Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi and Averroes engaged deeply with Platonic ideas, developing their own versions of the theory of forms and the ideal state. Jewish philosophers like Maimonides incorporated Platonic metaphysics into their theological systems. Christian theologians like Augustine absorbed so much Platonic philosophy that Christianity itself was fundamentally shaped by Plato's ideas about the soul, the forms, and the relationship between the eternal and the temporal. In the Renaissance, the rediscovery of Plato's complete works in the original Greek sparked a revival of interest that would shape European thought for centuries. The Platonic Academy in Florence, founded by Marsilio Ficino under the patronage of Cosimo de' Medici, became a center for the study of Plato and the development of Renaissance humanism. Ficino translated all of Plato's dialogues into Latin, making them accessible to scholars throughout Europe. The influence of Plato can be seen in the art of the Renaissance, in the political philosophy of the Enlightenment, in the Romantic movement's emphasis on transcendent ideals. Today, 24 centuries after his death, Plato remains one of the most influential philosophers who ever lived. The theory of forms, the allegory of the cave, the ideal of the philosopher king, the Socratic method. These ideas continue to challenge and inspire, to provoke debate and reflection. His dialogues are still read in philosophy courses around the world, still studied and analyzed by scholars, still capable of surprising readers with their insight and relevance. Students encounter them in philosophy courses, finding that the questions Plato raised about justice and virtue, knowledge and reality, the soul and the good life, are questions that each generation must grapple with anew. The questions have not changed. What is justice? How should we live? What can we know with certainty? Is there an objective good, or is morality merely a matter of opinion and convention? Should society be governed by the wise few or by the many? What is the relationship between individual freedom and social order? But perhaps Plato's deepest legacy is not any specific doctrine or theory, but rather his conviction that these questions matter, that education is the key to human flourishing, that the unexamined life is not worth living, that there are truths worth pursuing even if they can never be fully grasped. He showed us that philosophy is not an abstract academic exercise but the most practical of all endeavors because it addresses the most fundamental question of all, how we should live. When Socrates chose to drink the hemlock rather than flee into exile, when he used his trial as an opportunity to defend philosophy itself rather than save his own life, when he spent his final hours discussing the immortality of the soul with his grieving friends, he was demonstrating what it means to live philosophically, to value truth and virtue above comfort and survival. He showed that there are principles worth dying for, that integrity matters more than longevity, that how we face death is the ultimate test of how we have lived. And when Plato, haunted by his teacher's death, spent the next 4 decades creating a philosophical system that would explain what had gone wrong and how it might be fixed, when he founded an academy that would last for centuries, when he wrote dialogues that would be read and studied for millennia, he was showing us what it means to respond to injustice not with despair or revenge but with thought, with the patient work of reason seeking understanding, with the determination to build something lasting from the ruins of tragedy. This, perhaps, is the true meaning of the allegory of the cave. We are all prisoners to some degree, trapped in our own limited perspectives, seeing shadows and taking them for reality. Our senses deceive us, our prejudices blind us, our passions mislead us. The comfortable certainties we cling to are often illusions, the authorities we trust are often no wiser than we are, the values our society teaches us may be deeply flawed. But we have the capacity, through education and effort, to turn our souls toward the light, to ascend toward truth. It is a difficult journey, painful and disorienting. We must leave behind comfortable illusions, question everything we thought we knew, face the possibility that much of what we believed was wrong. Like the prisoner emerging from the cave, we will stumble and struggle, our eyes hurting from the unaccustomed light, tempted to retreat back into the familiar darkness. But if we persevere, if we continue the ascent despite the difficulty, we can achieve genuine knowledge, understanding of truths that do not change with fashion or opinion, wisdom that can guide us through the confusions and conflicts of life. And once we have seen even a glimpse of that light, we have an obligation to return to help others make the same journey, knowing all the while that they may not thank us for it, that they may mock us or worse, that we may face the same fate as Socrates. It is a difficult path, the philosophical life. It requires turning away from the comfortable illusions that most people accept without question. It requires questioning your assumptions, admitting your ignorance, following arguments even when they lead to uncomfortable conclusions. It requires living according to reason even when passion or appetite might seem to offer easier paths. It means being willing to stand alone, to face ridicule or worse, to pursue truth even at great personal cost. But it is, in Plato's view, the only life truly worth living, for it is the life most fully human, the life in which our rational nature is given its proper expression and development. The alternative, the unexamined life, the life lived without reflection or inquiry, accepting whatever values and beliefs our society happens to teach us, is a life lived in the cave, mistaking shadows for reality, never knowing what we are missing. And so, as the fire burns low and the night grows deep, as you drift further into sleep, let this story settle into your consciousness like a seed planted in fertile soil. Remember Socrates asking questions in the agora, caring nothing for wealth or power, seeking only wisdom and virtue, dying with dignity and courage for his principles. Remember Plato sitting in that prison cell, watching his teacher die, vowing to dedicate his life to understanding and combating the ignorance that had led to such injustice. Remember the prisoners in the cave, comfortable in their darkness, seeing only shadows, resistant to liberation. Remember the journey upward, painful and difficult, toward the light of truth. Remember that education is not filling a bucket but lighting a fire, that the unexamined life is not worth living, that justice requires knowledge, and knowledge requires the courage to question everything. Let these images accompany you into sleep, the sun rising over the Acropolis, illuminating the white marble of the Parthenon in the golden light of dawn, the philosophical conversations in the shaded gardens near the academy, where young men eager for wisdom gathered to debate and discuss. The flickering shadows on the cave walls slowly giving way to the brilliance of true reality. Socrates' calm face as he drank the hemlock, still teaching, still seeking truth, still showing us what it means to live and die as a philosopher. For this is what Plato offers us across the gulf of 24 centuries. Not a set of doctrines to be accepted on authority, not a political program to be implemented by force, but an invitation to join in the great conversation about truth and justice, knowledge and virtue, the soul and the good life. A conversation that began in ancient Athens and continues wherever human beings gather to think seriously about how we should live. And if, as you drift into dreams, you find yourself in a dark cave watching shadows flicker on a wall, remember that you have within you the capacity to turn your head, to stand up, to begin that difficult ascent toward the light. Remember that there is a sun beyond the cave, a truth beyond appearances, a good beyond mere pleasure or pain. Remember that the journey is difficult but worthwhile, that wisdom is worth pursuing even if never fully attained, that the philosophical life, the examined life, the life lived in pursuit of truth and justice, this is the best life for human beings. Sleep now, and may your dreams be filled with the light of the sun shining on eternal truths, with the voice of Socrates asking one more question, with the vision of a world where wisdom guides power and justice reigns supreme. Sleep and wake refreshed, ready to begin your own ascent from the cave, your own pursuit of the good life, your own examination of the assumptions and beliefs that shape your world. For this is Plato's final lesson, that each of us must make the journey for ourselves, that no one can be carried forcibly into the light, that education is not something done to us but something we must actively pursue. The academy is closed, its gardens long returned to dust, its buildings crumbled into ruins. But the invitation stands open still, to think, to question, to seek truth wherever it may lead. And with that thought, let sleep claim you fully as the story of Plato, the aristocrat who became a philosopher, the student who lost his teacher, the dreamer who imagined a perfect state, the writer whose words still speak across the millennia, fades into the background of consciousness, becoming part of the rich texture of dreams, where perhaps, if we are fortunate, we may catch a glimpse of those eternal forms that Plato spent his life trying to help us see. Rest well, traveler. The cave is dark, but somewhere above, the sun is always shining.